So welcome everyone to Bible with Bill. We're on number 3.
3, Alice.
3.
Yes.
I mean, it's going well. Bill, do you want to describe where we are, who we're with, and what you're going to say?
Thank you, Alice. So I'm sitting in Chris and Alice's office in Hope Chapel, and I'm with Alice, who I'm talking to today. Alice is my audience, and Hannah is our technical whiz kid, doing the stuff with the slides and the sound and all the stuff that us mere mortals find it hard to understand. So it's good that we've got Hannah here as well, bringing the skills. So that's where we are. Come on, Alice, get it together. So what are we going to look at today? Quick intro. So we're going to do, again, something different today. There hasn't really been a theme in the podcasts we've done so far. What I'm going to look at is the subject of pastors and pastoring and pastoral care, the word pastor. And where it comes from is about just over 10 years ago, I started to lead a church and it went okay. But if I got any kind of negative feedback in the early days in particular, it was that I wasn't pastoral enough. There was something people were expecting, something people wanted that I wasn't delivering. And their description of that thing was pastoral. I wasn't pastoral. And I tried to understand what they meant, but it was quite hard to pin down. It was quite a slippery term. Different people seemed to mean different things by it, but also it seemed quite vague and quite, they were describing more of a feeling. It was something about my style and how it made them feel, rather than something concrete and specific. And so it set me wondering, well, what does the Bible say about this? So I did a little Bible study. I looked up the word pastoral and every occurrence of the word pastor or pastoral in the New Testament, the Greek New Testament. And I was surprised by the results. Wind forward to the present day, and in Hope Chapel, we're having this conversation at the moment about leadership structures, about do we need to appoint new people to the staff or to leadership roles. And in all of these discussions, again, it's been a bit like an echo. Some people are saying similar things to what I was hearing 10 years ago. And what I found is in those discussions, I've kind of been biting my tongue because I've got all of this kind of stuff going on and I want to say, yeah, but hang on a minute. But what I've understood is that I have this luxury of a platform where I have the opportunity, I'm lucky to have this opportunity where I can say, well, actually, I think this. And so in a very self-indulgent way, I'm going to use the next hour or so, 3 hours or so, to have a look at that question. What does the Bible say about the word pastoral? If that's okay.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
It's really helpful. What I love about what you're going to do is it's not just like ideas or thoughts you've had, but also it's pertinent to where we're at.
Absolutely.
So that's a real gift.
And hopefully it's useful.
Yeah.
It might ruffle a few feathers, but that's what we're here for.
That's what we're here for.
And when the Bible ruffles feathers,
Yes.
I think that's a healthy thing.
Great.
So have we got the first slide up? The one that's so that's the introductory slide. Those are the words we're looking at: pastor and pastoral. So let's have a look at the evidence. So what I did was I got a concordance out of the biggest concordance I could find. The concordance lists every word in the Bible and tells you where you can find it. So it's a listing of all the occurrences of a certain word. So the first thing I did was look up in a concordance the word pastoral. And I made a big list of all the occurrences of the word pastoral in the NIV. Would you like to see that list? Okay, hopefully Hannah is now showing you that list. It doesn't occur once, which I found staggering. Given the amount of time that in church culture, so not just Hope, not just Bristol Vineyard, but the whole church culture, the amount of conversation about pastoral stuff, which kind of takes for granted that this is an established Christian, biblical, orthodox thing, and that we all know what we're talking about. I was staggered that there isn't a single instance of the word pastoral in the Bible. So I then thought, well, what about pastor? You know, the role of pastor. There must be a lot of, you know, because it's pretty much the standard word that we use for church lead. You know, if they're not vicars or priests, they're pastors.
Yes.
So I looked up the word pastor and came up with, again, a very long list. Here it is. Ephesians 4, verse 11. And again, that's it. That's it. If you don't believe, I mean, I found it hard to believe. If you don't believe me, grab a concordance, look it up for yourself. And so I was staggered. I assumed it was established biblical theology. Now, I'm not saying because it doesn't occur in the Bible, it's not a legitimate subject. You know, it's not something we should talk about. I think what people mean by pastoral is important stuff and needs to be understood and talked about. You know, there are no references in the New Testament to websites, but most churches have a website.
Yeah.
So it doesn't mean it's off limits. It doesn't mean it's bad or wrong.
Yeah.
But I think it does mean two things. I think it means, first of all, we need to actually be clear about what we mean.
Yeah.
You can't take it for granted that we're all talking about the same biblical concept. So we need to understand and actually be explicit about, when I say the word pastoral, I mean this.
Yeah.
And there's this, the other thing is, I think because it's not a biblical word, then I think it's not, you can't take for granted that it's kind of orthodox truth. In other words, it's debatable. It's open to critique. It needs to be defended. And that's absolutely fine. And that you can defend, you know, various arguments about pastoral care or pastors or pastoring. But your argument is one of reason and evidence, rather than this is the word of God.
Yes.
And so it's in that category of idea rather than a biblical idea,
Yes.
if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, so that's the kind of introduction. So what I want to do basically is two things. A bit of quick signposting. And the first one is, we do have this one instance. Ephesians 4 verse 11 talks about pastors. And it's actually quite an interesting verse. It's a very interesting verse for a number of different reasons. And it is quite revealing about what we mean by, what the New Testament's mindset when it comes to the role of pastor. And so we're going to have a look at that, Ephesians 4:11. But also, secondly, I want to try and have an estimate of what people tend to mean when they use the word pastoral, and kind of critique it from a biblical point of view. Because I think there are certain themes that come up again and again and again when people use those words. So what does the Bible say about those ideas, if that's all right? So that's basically the plan for the rest of the session.
Brilliant.
Good.
Yeah.
If I have permission to move on.
Yeah.
Okay, here we go.
That's great.
So first of all, I think, Hannah, you've got the verse up. So this is Ephesians 4:11-13. So, and it's a famous passage. So Christ himself gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the pastors and teachers to equip his people for works of service, so that the body of Christ may be built up, until we all reach unity in the faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God, and become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. So there are these 5 roles, and their job together, doing different things, but with the same aim, which is to make people mature so that the whole community becomes Christ-like.
So good.
That's the job of those 5 roles. And among them is pastors. But I just said it only occurs once. And that's true-ish. But it could also be argued that that word occurs no times. And it could be argued that it occurs lots of times. Now that sounds like a riddle. But what I'm talking about is the difference between an English translation and the original Greek text. And I'm afraid this is the first time we've done this. This is the 3rd podcast we've done, but we're actually going to look at a bit of Greek.
I think we need to, Bill.
Oh, well, is that okay?
I'm actually hoping that you were going to do that.
Well, I know it gives people the willies. And so I wanted to say we're going to take it very gently, and I'll hold your hand, and it's all right. I know it's scary.
Bill, it's
but
a safe place.
exactly. So we are going to have a little look at the Greek. So if I can have the next slide, please. Now I know this won't make sense to a lot of people, but this is Ephesians 4 verse 11 in the original Greek text. And what I've done is I've underlined the word that our English versions translate as pastors. It's poimenas. That underlined word is poimenas, which is, in our versions, almost all the time translated as pastors. Now, the interesting thing is, if you read an English translation, pastors occurs once in this place. But if you read the New Testament in the original Greek, the same word crops up lots of times. So, for example, the next slide, please, Hannah. This is a very, very famous verse. This is John 10, verse 14. Ego eimi ho poimein, which is the same root word, but here it's the nominative singular. In the Ephesians one, it's accusative plural. So it's a different case, but the same word. Ego eimi ho poimein ho kalos, which translated into English means I am the good shepherd.
Nice.
Poimein, the Greek word, crops up lots and lots of times in the New Testament, and in every case it's translated shepherd because that's what it means, except for Ephesians 4:11, where in nearly every single English version it's translated pastors, which is fascinating. I find that fascinating. Why is it? I think, this is what I think, because I've noticed the tendency. Religious people like to make their roles sound grander by not translating them into the basic English meaning. So, for example, apostle, we talk about apostles. Apostello simply means to send. So the sent out ones, people who are sent. That's all an apostle is someone who's sent. The 12 were called apostles because Jesus sent them out. The Great Commission, go out into all the world. And that's why they're apostles. Paul and Silas were sent out from Tarsus, so they were the sent ones. But we don't say the sent ones. We say, or sent people. We say apostles because it sounds more religious. It sounds more special, and so there's a tendency to not translate. We hold on to the special Greek or Latin in order to give it a bit of a cachet. I think that's what's going on, and I think that's why the tradition is that in this one instance It's not translated as shepherd, it's translated as
Yeah.
pastor. Another example, baptizo just means immerse. But we don't say, I immerse you in the name of the Father, the Son, and that. We say, I baptize, because it makes it religious and it makes it special. We just don't translate it into English. We use the original Greek. And I think that's what's going on. But hang on a minute, you just said the Greek for shepherd was poimen, and it is. But the Latin for shepherd is pastor,
Yeah, okay.
which gives us a clue about who first developed the practice of calling this role pastor instead of shepherd. I imagine it originated in Rome. And it's become the tradition. So we continue to this day to call this role, which a normal a native Greek speaker reading the New Testament 2,000 years ago would have read shepherd. There's nothing in the text to say that this should be translated any different. The five ministries to a native Greek speaker reading the original text would have been apostles, prophets, apostles, prophets, evangelists, shepherds, and teachers.
Wow.
Okay? So actually we're talking about shepherds. Okay, well, what does that mean? What does it mean to say there is this church leader role, one of the five ministries, which is shepherd? And I think there are two ways of looking at it. One is, it was a common metaphor just in the ancient world to call leaders shepherds. So, for example, in Homer, in the Iliad, in the Odyssey, he talks about shepherds of the people when he's referring to kings and princes. So it's a common word that was used in that culture. He's our shepherd means leader of a group of people. And so I think it partly means that. It's the local leader. So it's a legitimate word. It's legitimate to call the pastor of a local church a pastor. It's a bit strange to use a Latin word but instead of shepherd, but there you go. But I think there's another way of looking at it, which is in Judeo-Christian thought, it also had an extra layer of meaning because both the Old Testament and the New Testament contrast the idea of God as the ideal leader and the good shepherd, as opposed to your typical human leader who are bad shepherds. So I think it's in Isaiah, for example, it's certainly the Old Testament prophets. God speaks through the prophet and he says, these are bad shepherds. Your current kings, O Israel, are bad shepherds. I will be your good shepherd. Which of course has extra resonance when Jesus in John chapter 10 says, I am the good shepherd. We tend to miss it, but in a way he's saying, I am the fulfillment of that prophecy. I am the good shepherd. And what it tended to mean two things. The shepherd who would love the sheep as opposed to using them. Bad kings were out for themselves. They would just use the sheep for their own purposes, whereas a shepherd in the manner of God would serve the sheep, would be interested in the sheep's welfare, the sheep's... he would love the sheep. And that's what a good shepherd was. But a bit more than that, he would also, as a result of his shepherding, the sheep would become fully mature. They would grow and become fully mature. So the result of good shepherding would be the perfect flock, would be the flock of sheep that fulfilled, so talking about the nation of Israel, under the good shepherd, Israel would grow and become the nation it was meant to be. It would flourish. You'd get a flock that flourished. Nice alliteration. So that's, I think that's the thought behind why Paul plucks out, this role of shepherd. I think that's what's going on in the background. He's talking about that kind of leader. Before we move on, I think there's one more interesting thing about this particular verse, Ephesians 4:11, if that's all right.
Yeah.
And it's this. Now, I've already played around with the idea, does pastor occur once, or is it no times, or is it lots of times? And, it's about the translation. There's another dilemma, which is it actually 5 ministries,
Yes.
or is it 4? And it's something that comes out very clearly in the Greek. In fact, it's kind of, I think it's more clear. So I'm looking for the slide, going onwards to the Greek, that Ephesians 4:11 in the Greek again. Now I'll try and lead us through this slowly. So I don't want to patronise you Greek speakers out there, but there's something about the grammar of how Paul lists these 5 ministries that's a bit odd. So you see the underlined word, so that's poimenas, meaning pastors or shepherds. The 2 words before that, touste, that means some. So touste poimenas, some shepherds. Now, if you go up to the top line, you'll see that each of the roles are preceded by touste or tous men. So going to the last 2 words in the top line, tous men apostolus, some apostles. Touste prophetas, some prophets. Touste euangelistas, evangelists. And then finally, touste poimenas kai didaskalos, some pastors or shepherds and teachers. So the grammar changes. It's like the last 2, shepherds and teachers, are lumped together as a 4th category. If there were 5 categories, you'd expect to see a touste in front of didaskalos, teachers, as well as the other 4, but it's not. And so that change must mean something. It implies that there are 4, or it might imply that there are 4 groups here. There's a group of people whose role is apostles, a group who are prophets, a group who are evangelists, and a 4th group who are prophets, teachers. Pastors, teachers. They're leaders who teach. They grow people and mature people by teaching them. That's how it could be read. Now, which is it? Is it 4 or is it 5? To be honest, the scholars are, as far as I can see, is kind of a 50-50 split. So, but, for example, in the Message, so the next slide, please, Hannah. This is Eugene Peterson. He handed out gifts of apostle, prophet, evangelist, and pastor-teacher. So Eugene is saying, actually, it's 4. And he's saying that there's one group here who shepherd people, who bring people to maturity through their teaching. Now, I find this interesting. I find it interesting because often when people talk about pastoral leaders and teachers, it's almost like they're contrasting them. On the one hand, you've got the teachers, and we need them, but we also need people who are more pastoral. And I think this understanding of the only occurrence of the word pastor in the New Testament kind of questions that a bit. It says if it's not the same role, then it's 2 different roles who are very closely aligned. They have the same goal, which is to bring people to maturity, and some do it in their leadership style, some do it through teaching. And I think both are valid interpretations. But I think there's another thing that's interesting, which is when shepherd is used, particularly by Jesus and Paul, to describe this leader role, it tends to focus on 2 different things. One is feeding. So that, for example, end of John's Gospel, when Jesus reinstates Peter, what does he say? Do you love me? Yes, I love you. Feed my sheep. Feed my sheep. feed my sheep. And so there's something about feeding the flock so that they grow to the maturity. How do leaders feed the flock? Well, the obvious way is through teaching. And there's another way in which shepherd is used as a metaphor by both Jesus and Paul, which is about protecting the flock from the wolves.
Yeah.
Now, who are the wolves? If you read, Acts 20, Paul stands up and he warns the church about false teachers. And he says, these are the wolves. How do you combat false teaching?
Yeah.
Good teaching. And so I think there's a strong argument that actually they're pretty closely aligned, that teachers are pastors and pastors are teachers. And I think it's a good corrective to both those who call themselves pastors and those who call themselves teachers. If you're saying I'm a pastor, well, to what extent are your flock maturing and growing and deepening in the faith and becoming more Christ-like as a result of your leading?
Yeah.
Or are you just spinning the plates, keeping the show on the road?
Yeah.
Is there growth in the depth and the Christ-likeness of the flock? It's also a good challenge to teachers. Are you just telling people interesting stuff, or are they actually growing?
Yes.
Are they growing and deepening and becoming more mature as a result of your teaching?
Yeah.
So I think it's a healthy challenge both ways, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's Ephesians 4:11. We've done a bit of a deep dive into the Greek. I hope it wasn't too painful. So the second thing I wanted to do was kind of turn to look at this, what seems to be the common understanding of the word pastoral, and kind of critique it a bit from a biblical point of view. This idea that that pastoral is something that leaders need to be and do. What do we mean by pastoral? Well, here's my suggestion. I don't know if you agree with this. I've come up with, this is Bill's dictionary. The next slide, I've got pastoral care. And I think people tend to mean, well, actually I think they mean three things. The first thing, some people talking about being pastoral, they talk about what I've just been talking about. Leading the church, protecting the church, guiding the church in such a way that it's healthy and flourishes and becomes more Christ-like. And I think that's entirely valid. I think that's a good use of the word pastoral. A second meaning, I think, is loving, meaning caring for, looking after, protecting, meeting needs. Okay, so pastoral care is caring for people, looking after people, meeting people's needs. I think there's a third thing that I pick up. When people talk about pastoral, it's sometimes used as an adjective to describe personality or interpersonal style. And a pastoral person is someone who's kind of emotionally warm, supportive, empathetic or empathic. I never know how you meant to say that. But you know what I mean? Sensitive, touchy-feely. And so I think that's often what people mean when they describe a person as pastoral. They're talking about a personal style, what they're like. I don't know if you agree with that. Hello, audience out there. I don't know if you agree with those. If answers on a postcard. If you want to have the argument, if you've got a different definition, when you use the word pastoral, you mean something different. Then let's have a chat. I really do welcome people disagreeing, arguing, asking questions. But if, for the purposes of argument, these are what it means. What do we think of that? You could say, how can anyone criticize those things? Loving, caring for, looking after, protecting, meeting needs. Who can argue with that? That's good stuff, isn't it, right? being emotionally warm, supportive, empathetic, sensitive. That's not a bad list of qualities. How can anyone criticize that? And it's all good stuff, right? And I would say, yes, it is. I agree. That's all good stuff. But I have two concerns or questions. Because remember, what we're talking about is the argument that leaders, pastors, shepherds need to do this stuff and be like this. And I have two questions. And the first one, the first critique is, I agree it's all good stuff, but whose job is it? So that looking at the first, loving people, caring for people, looking after people, protecting people, meeting people's needs. I agree it's good stuff, and I agree it's biblical stuff. You know, I think the prime example is John 13, where Jesus washes the disciples' feet. You know, he sees a need and he's willing to get his hands dirty. He's willing to meet that need. He gets down on his knees and he washes their feet. And it's clearly a metaphor. In fact, he says, you know, this is how you love one another. Now go and do likewise. And the point is, this is for all of us. This is everyone. We're all called. You know, both Jesus and Paul had this idea of a community where the people would love one another, and what that looked like was serving one another. You know, the loving people in Jesus and Paul's language. It means, it's a big concept. It means all sorts of different things. But front and center is this idea of giving oneself to serve others, to meet people's needs. And the picture of it is washing feet. But the point is, it's for all of us. It's not a special role that we give to one person. And the thing about, you know, the problem with serving one another is we don't like it. The problem with, you know, sacrificing ourselves for others is we run away from that. You know, the idea of spending our lives spotting people's needs, rolling up our sleeves, getting down on our knees and washing feet is something we find distasteful. And we'll do anything to get out of it. And I think a common way of trying to get out of it is to say, well, actually, that's this person's job. And you have this we turn this New Testament idea of what a church looks like upside down. And instead of a community that are all serving one another, we have this idea that it's one person's job to meet the needs of the community, and everyone else's job is to have their needs met. And I think that's, now I'm putting it in an extreme, I know people don't actually mean that, but I think that's the risk, that we appoint someone to be the servant, to be the, where it's all of our jobs. That's my first concern. And my second concern is linked to it, which is, if anyone has a slightly different role, then Ephesians 4:11 to 13 tells us it's these four or five roles, because their job is to equip the church to serve. The church's job is to serve one another, to give themselves, to wash feet. But these five particular roles are there to enable the church to do that. And in a way, if we make it the shepherd's job, the pastor's job, to care for people, to spot needs and meet needs, to serve, then we take that responsibility away from the whole community, and we prevent them from growing into that role themselves. And so the pastor ends up doing the opposite of what they're meant to do, which is releasing that ministry, empowering and giving that ministry. For example, I'm intrigued that often the example of pastoral care that's given is checking up on people who haven't been for a while. I don't know if you've noticed this, but I hear it a lot. That what does pastoral care look like? Well, it looks like keeping an eye on how people are doing, and if someone hasn't been on a Sunday for a few weeks, then someone needs to give them a phone call to make sure they're okay. And I'm intrigued by where that comes from as the standard example of what the pastor's role is, or pastoral care looks like. But who? Let me put it this way: who's the best person to do that? Now, I would have thought the best person to phone someone who hasn't been for a while is the person who knows them best.
Yeah.
Whatever. Now, it might be the person who knows them from before, who, if they're new to the church, who introduced them to the church.
Yeah.
It might be the one who lives closest to them. It might be the one who's got to know them the best while they've been there.
Yeah.
But so there are lots of candidates for who's the best person to do that. But the one thing that will prevent those people from taking responsibility and doing it themselves is if they think it's someone else's job.
Yes.
If they think it's this pastor's job, who's got a list of people that they go through every day, making sure that they're all right. It's crazy. Just in terms of resources, it's great. One person to do it for everyone versus the whole community to do it for one another. There's another aspect to this, which is what responsibility does the individual themselves bear for bringing themselves to church? If there's one thing that's going to prevent them from taking responsibility and beginning to think along the lines of, if I want the benefits from being a member of this community, then I have to commit. If there's one thing that'll stop them from doing that, is having this father figure who they know is going to, phone them up all the time. Oh, that's great. I don't need to actually grow up. I don't need to mature. I don't need to be a responsible person. So that's my second concern, that, if pastors do this job of meeting everyone's needs, kind of being the father, then people won't grow. People won't do the very thing that pastors are actually called to make happen, which is to grow people, grow the community to Christ-like maturity, where we're all serving one another. So I have a third concern, and it's about this next thing. So the second half of this slide, so it's all right, the same slide, Hannah, but going down, this idea that pastoral means emotionally warm, supportive, empathetic, and sensitive. Now, I understand why we want our leaders to be like that, because it feels nice.
Yeah.
Of course, I want my leaders to be warm towards me, to be supportive, to be empathetic, to be sensitive, because it'll make me feel good. But here's a different question. What is the leadership style that causes people to grow? What is the leadership style that causes people to grow? Standard management model for the leadership style that causes people to grow is this little chart. So we've got what leaders need to do is support and challenge. You need both. It's a both and. So it's not wrong to be supportive and warm and empathetic, but you also need to be challenging. You also need to give responsibility, to give too much responsibility in some ways, to drop people in the deep end, so that they learn, so that they grow, so that they're stretched. You need to challenge them in terms of rebuking them, saying, actually, I think you got that wrong. You need both. If you only have a challenging, kind of rebuking, delegating leadership style, the risk is people will burn out, will shrivel, will collapse, will fail, will give up. If you only have a supportive style, people will just get comfortable and they'll stagnate because there's nothing to urge them on to more. And the best leaders are those who do both. And again, now this is meant to be a biblical critique, so Jesus is our example. Who is the best pastor that we meet in the New Testament? It's Jesus. He is the good shepherd. He's the model shepherd. So how those disciples who grow the most, who you see that transformation, what does he do with them? And I think the prime example is Peter. You know, if you follow Peter's journey from, you know, this kind of idiot who you meet at the start of Mark's Gospel, who's so confident and so foolish, compared with the Peter you meet in the Acts of Apostles, who's become this great leader. What does Jesus do to cause Peter to grow in that way, to mature into the Peter we meet in the book of Acts? Well, yes, some of the time he's supportive and warm and encouraging, but there are also eye-watering times. You know, Mark 8, you know, when Peter says, you know, no, you're not going to die. And Jesus said, get behind me, Satan. You know, that's not warm and sensitive and encouraging. Well, it kind of is, but there's a reason he's doing that. And if someone's style is only, you know, warm, supportive, encouraging, and they can't do the challenging, the rebuking, the giving people big responsibility, then you never get Peter's journey going on. And the final thought is, which is rarer? Out of those two styles, particularly in Christian culture where everyone's so nice, actually finding leaders who will challenge for the sake of people's growth is it's gold dust. People who are supportive, I'd say, are 10 a penny. If I think about in my journey, the number of times leaders have been willing to rebuke me or challenge me, I can count them on the fingers of one hand, compared with the amount of time that I get support and warmth and encouragement. But those are the times when I've grown the most. Those that, and particularly in terms of maturity and becoming responsible, becoming a bigger person, that's what I've needed. And so, now don't get me wrong, I'm not saying, you know, a supportive style is wrong. I'm saying both and. But I am saying that the thing that we're missing, I think, far more than the warm and encouraging, is the challenging. That's my opinion. I want to finish with a story. So when I first moved to Bristol, I was at Christ Church, and this is in 1989-ish, and there was a guy there who, I'm not going to say his name, but he was part of our circle of friends, and he wrote me a letter. And I was quite surprised to get a letter from him because I saw this group of friends every week. But in this letter, he gave me some feedback. He said, what I've noticed is, and his feedback was, I was quite mean. That, you know, when we went to the pub and everyone was paying for drinks, and I'd kind of be the last to offer. And it was the most painful letter to receive. But on reflection, I could see what he meant. You know, and it was kind of not, I wasn't trying to get away with it. I'm just a very passive person. You know, I'm quite slow to notice these things. And so, at least I hope that's the case. But it stung me. But what it did was cause me to take it seriously and to say, I need to change. And the point is, I had a group of friends, none of whom said anything. They're all thinking it, but none of them said it, apart from this guy. And I look back on my life, and I think that was one of the biggest interventions in causing me to grow and become more grown up, more mature, develop a bit of character. And to me, that is the essence of being a good shepherd. It's not either or, it's both and. But I think the thing that we're missing often in Christian in churches is that shepherding challenge that's willing to be unpopular and willing to say and do the painful thing in order to cause people to grow a bit. And that's it. Sorry. I know it's not easy to hear, but that's my biblical critique of this idea of what pastors need to be like. If you disagree, I genuinely mean this. I love disagreement. I don't know it all. I don't know it all. I know about half of it, and you might have the other half. So if you want to argue with me, I would welcome that. What do you think on this question? But anyway, more soon.
Yeah, no, I found that really helpful. I've got a few questions.
Okay,
Have
Alice?
we got time, Hannah?
Yeah, let's go for a minute.
So,
Actually, I'm not sure. I've been. No, I'm joking.
we're done.
What are your questions, Alice?
Well, going back to the 4 or 5
Yeah.
fold ministry,
Yeah.
is it that the fullness is Jesus? So he's the sent one, he's the prophet, the fulfillment of the Hebrew Bible's messianic profile, the prophet, he's the bringer of good news, and he's the pastor teacher, and then he distributes those, splits them up, if you like, amongst different leaders, and then when they come together, they represent all of Christ.
Yeah.
How do you know who is what, and how can we call those out in each other? The leaders, we have a lot of leaders at Hope. How can we call out those different roles? And is that a team leadership model for a local church, or would you say that is needed in a city? Those 4 or 5 ministries representing Jesus' leadership in a community, where, at what level, the micro to the macro, would you put them? Do you understand
Yeah, I do.
that question?
Yeah.
Right.
So it's a 2-part question.
Yeah.
So do they all come together? I think it's definitely the case that you can see Jesus as the model of each of these things.
Yeah.
You know, Jesus is, he is the prototype apostle because he's sent. He's sent to earth.
Yes.
You know, he's sent to take on flesh.
Yeah.
You know, in John, for example, it's a common theme, a common meme. You know, this idea that he's come from heaven to earth and he's been sent in order to reveal God.
Yeah.
And so, and you can do that for each of the 5. All I'd say is, I don't think it's quite right that when the 5 come together, they become Jesus, because I think a more Pauline view would be, in each local church, Jesus is the head.
Yes.
So he is there.
Yep.
He's the head, but the Spirit works through different humans to kind of flesh out some of that role.
Yeah.
But I think it's a really important concept that, you know, the human leader of a church is second in command.
That's good.
And Jesus' leadership, the fullness of Jesus' leadership, is he's the head of the church.
Yeah.
The second one about how those, or I think is how do we spot it?
Yes.
And how are they distributed locally? And
do we need to build teams that intentionally spot and put those together, or do we just have the pastor teacher kind of team? Like the elders, the relationship between the idea of elders or ministers, is that diakonos is one, that's deacons actually.
Yeah, ministers and deacons is the same idea. It's all about service.
Yes.
And presbyteros is elders, which is overseers.
Yes.
So those are the 2 themes.
Yeah.
Ministers, servants, overseers, elders.
Yeah.
I think it's a really good conversation to have. I think churches don't talk enough about gifts and gifts. It's such a strong theme in not just in Paul, in Peter as well. In his letters to churches about how to do things, they keep on emphasizing gifting.
Yeah.
And I have this theory that the idea of a church where everyone serves can sound like drudgery if you don't include the idea of gifting. If
Right.
we're all just one another's slaves,
Right.
who wants to be part of that?
Yeah.
But I think there's something about serving with your gift,
Yes.
which is life rather than death.
Yeah, that's good.
So it might be hard work,
Yeah.
but it's being what you're meant to be.
Yeah.
It's so fulfilling. It's so rich. You'll never feel as alive.
Yeah.
And once you've tasted it,
Yeah.
you just want to do it more and more and more.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the idea of being a servant is releasing, because I think the two go hand in hand. And I think the sometimes there are jobs that just need doing, and you
Yes.
need someone to do it.
Yeah.
But if most of the time the service you provide to others in your community in order to build them up is about exercising your gift,
Yeah.
then it's light, and it's a yoke that's light. And I think that applies to everyone, and not just the 5 minutes. I think it's a conversation we should be having all the time in the church community. We should be asking people, what are you?
Yes.
How do you know? How do you spot it? How do you identify it?
Yeah.
I think there are certain key things that help to identify people's gifts. But I think if you're having that as a regular conversation in the community, then what you'll discover is there are some who are evangelists. There are some who want to be sent out.
Yes.
They're church planters. They get itchy feet if they're in one place too long, and they dream of establishing a new community somewhere else where Christian community is thin on the ground. Yes, I agree, but I'd say it's bigger than just the fivefold, fourfold, ministries. I'd say it's everyone.
Yeah.
It's what are you?
Yeah.
And if we like, I think it's a bigger conversation about how you spot gifts and that kind of thing. I think, it's probably too big to go into now. But the final thing about is it regional? Is it local?
Yes.
Is it?
Yeah.
I think God gives the gifts that He wants to give as churches, as communities, and as regions have need.
Okay. Yeah.
So we're more on the receiving end.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think it's up to Him.
Yeah.
I would be surprised if in a local church you have an apostle, a prophet, a evangelist, etc., etc.
Yeah.
I think it's more these are the themes to look for.
Yes.
And you tend to get, if there's a real gap, then God will fill that. Keep your eyes open for who He might be bringing or who He might be raising up to fill that gap.
Yeah.
If it's a city that's short on evangelism, then the city should look for evangelists.
Yeah.
But all of them, I think, come out of the local church.
Yeah.
I think it's healthy when apostleship. But Paul was sent originally from Jerusalem and then from Tarsus. But he has this continual sense of having been sent, and not forgetting where he's sent from, and returning, and his concern for the church in Jerusalem, raising the big sum of money because they're in poverty. It's not about being a free agent.
Yes.
It's about growing out of the local church and being a gift to a city or a local area, but always being rooted in the local church.
Really good.
That's my view.
Yeah. So going back to the pastor-teacher conversation.
Yeah.
The reflection, I'm reflecting back, what you're saying is maybe culturally we've put we've attached some words to that, and those are okay, those are great, but we also maybe Christian culture within the UK need to also make sure we've got the balance of challenge. I imagine there'll be other cultures around the world where they're heavy on challenge and maybe weaker on some of our strengths. But what you're saying is, what you're discerning is, in our cultural moment here, in Bristol, in the West, but possibly actually in Britain, maybe even distinct from America, that the pastor-teacher role needs to move up on challenge to almost balance the support. Is that a fair reflection of what you're saying?
Yeah,
We're kind of getting right, also getting wrong.
I think it is. I think what I'm saying is, I think I'm saying we, the risk if
Yes.
you only have supportive, warm, encouraging
Yes.
leadership styles is people don't grow.
Yes.
And I'm saying we see
Yeah.
a lot of that in Christian culture in the UK.
Yeah.
Not in every
Yes.
church, you know, there are different denominations, and some are
Yeah.
much more challenging,
Yeah.
and therefore I think that's what we probably need more
Yeah.
of, rather than more of the supportive, encouraging, etc., etc. I'm saying we need both.
Yeah.
It's both and.
Yeah.
It's not either or. But I think what I'm also saying is, we tend to emphasize personal style
Right.
and personality,
Yeah.
and as a leadership trait, in a way that the Bible isn't really interested in. The Bible's much more interested in what people do
Yes.
and the outcome of that,
Yeah.
rather than, and we tend to, I think there's a tendency, not everyone, but we make central what the person's like in their personality, and say, oh, we want a bit more of that. Whereas I think the Bible's more interested in outcomes
Yeah.
and doing what needs to be done in order to, you know, it's more purpose driven, it's more goal focused.
Yeah.
The pastor's job is to make individuals Christ-like, make the church Christ-like. Is it working or not?
Brilliant.
What does the pastor need to do in order to do that? They need to support and challenge.
Yes. Yeah.
People whose personality is naturally supportive can learn to challenge.
Yes.
It'll be uncomfortable for them,
Yeah.
but that's an area where they can grow.
Yeah.
And vice versa. There are people who are naturally challenging
Yeah.
who can become more supportive. But it doesn't really matter what their personality is. And we shouldn't choose people, I think, based on their personality. We should choose people on character,
Yes.
and are they able to do this job of growing people?
Yeah.
That's what I think.
That's really helpful. What I love about what you've said is you know, one of the 7 habits of highly successful people is the end in mind. The end of these roles is maturity in Christ, and that's, if it's working, great, and if it isn't, what do we need to do to tweak that? That's really helpful.
Absolutely. And I think I see a lot of churches which kind of go on.
Yes.
You know, they go on doing the same things week in, week out.
Yeah.
But are the people really growing? Are the people really
Yeah.
changing? And I think that's the risk if you don't have that goal,
Yeah.
that purpose outlook, and if you're not willing to challenge.
Yeah.
Again, that's harsh. You decide whether it's fair or not.
I think that's brilliant. I am going to end on a prayer because I actually feel
Groovy.
I'd like to pray this in for hope.
Okay.
Lord, I thank you so much for the clarity that you've given Bill in his mind, and also the gift that you've given him to be able to explain it clearly, so he not only understands it clearly but can explain with clarity. And we want to be a community where all of us grow in maturity in Christ. So we firstly bless all of us to be able to serve one another with our gifts, to all come alive using our gifts and serving one another. And we also bless the process we're going through for the right person or people to maybe be more kind of formally involved with that sort of pastor-teacher part of stewarding the community into maturity. So we bless us to be mature in Christ, and we bless us to have eyes to see the leadership that you're giving us. As Bill said, it's a gift from you to meet our needs in this time. Amen.
Amen.
Thanks, Bill.
It's all right,
Looking forward to next time.
Groovy. Yeah, what will it be?
Exactly.